one of my principal investigators was having a hard time with her projects, her HQP and her YP and her community partners engaging in like focusing themselves in the research. And it really started making me think about how can we get our stakeholders, how can we get our community partners, our YPs and our HQPs not to just sort of participate because it's a mandatory piece of a project, to really fully invest themselves in their projects and to communicate their projects in ways, the findings of their projects in ways accessible to community members who may not understand academic jargon or be interested or divest once they see academic jargon through a report. So it made me start thinking about what happens your projects and your stakeholders, your community partners, your staff aren't fully engaging in your project. Are they disinterested or divested from fully engaging? Maybe they don't have access to the same academic language that a report or a paper might have. Maybe they're not feeling valued and they're just sort of feeling invisible. Or maybe they're stuck on how to communicate findings that don't necessarily feel like anybody would pay attention to, or the community may not want to access. Or maybe they come from a community that's marginalized and really a stronger voice, and you're trying to figure out a way for your community partners to feel valued in the process. So these are things, as you're going forward with your projects, these might be questions that are living in you. And that's something that could be, sorry, I'm taking off my very loud keys. These may be some of the challenges and barriers that brought you to this place. I'm not sure. So we'll talk about that a bit later. So let's start with talking about what stories are. Stories are a way of connecting with one another. They're a way of paying attention and focusing on specific details that you might actually miss if you weren't looking at them through the lens of story. Stories actually take time. It takes time for us to tell our story and to hear that story from others. So it keeps us in the present, and it really keeps us focused on sort of minutia and details that often go missed. And stories can be a way to build community. They're a way to pass on history. They're a way to pass on teachings. We all have a story, and research projects have a story as well. And that narrative is usually shared in the format of academic research papers along the way. So what digital stories are can be similar in that you can still share the progress of your projects, but you're doing it in a way that is, it's sort of transcending the academic paper, which does have its place. Academic papers are highly valuable, and we use them all the time, and they're meant for a very specific audience. They're really directed at the academic community, the research community, and can be highly valuable. You know, poster presentations similarly can be very valuable, but within that specific community with the key group of stakeholders. So what we're looking to do is to transcend that in some ways, because we're starting to really work, especially here at Global Water Futures, with unconventional community, right? We're working with Indigenous communities. We have 14 Indigenous-led projects now, and that really has forced us to look at ourselves in the mirror and to practice what we preach as far as co-creative research. So ways to, if we're co-creating research with Indigenous communities who don't traditionally have access or use academic language, then we need to redial and re-examine how we can communicate research findings back and forth between researchers and community stakeholders. So that's been one driving this digital storytelling project for a bit, and communicating that out through different workshops and labs, whether it's been on site at different research sites or here at the university. So digital stories can be educative. Obviously, they're communicative. They're kind of on the far end of the spectrum of knowledge mobilization and communication somewhat overlap. Um, they can help build movement, help bring people together, and they definitely have research potential, especially when it comes to engaging the voice of your community in ways that will sort of up the level of investment that they have in research together. There's also this concept, especially in marginalized communities, for this counter narrative approach that really is about sort of challenging the dominant narrative that's already out there. And it really helps to empower that creative research process with and by non-academic stakeholders and any community whose voices might be marginalized or silenced through that academic speak and through the dominant paradigm. So we all have different roles that we play in different, parts of different projects who may or may not be a part of those communities or engaging those communities, but who are. This is a great way to help folks who are to not to empower people, but to have them step into their own power through their own voices and feel heard, whether it's at the end of a project, but we're considering this as a consistent practice throughout a project to build these stories together so that these voices, the community voices, can be uplifted and heard in a way that is directed and centered by them. And Story Center, we'll talk a little bit about in a second, they say, when we listen deeply and tell stories, we build a just and healthy world. So this is really an approach that we here at Global Water Futures at McMaster to be highly effective in working with our Indigenous-led projects. But outside of that, we've actually been working in some very sciencey, quote unquote, hard sciencey projects that you think this may not apply to. And I'll show you an example of one of those. Actually, you can tell a very dry science-based project. You can tell a story in an interesting and creative way. So the reason that we're bringing this to you is because we found that it's very valuable in helping translate knowledge between research projects and non-academic stakeholders. And it really can be effective in increasing the visibility of your project. So just briefly, a little bit of a history around what we call digital storytelling and where it came from. Back in the 80s, there was this sort of need growing on in the arts community to create a more accessible way for lay practitioners to become involved in art. And this is before digital video. It was a little bit less just because of technology and the cost of that. So as technology started growing in the 90s and digital technology started really coming to the forefront, a group of folks on the West Coast, Lambert, Ashley, and Mullen, they founded something called the San Francisco Digital Media Center in 1994. And that was sort of an iteration of a whole bunch of different digital media projects that they had been working on. And they built something called a community digital storytelling workshop. So this is sort of a digital storytelling lab that was in the San Francisco Bay Area. And they really started bringing community together to tell their stories. Eventually that became the what's now known as Story Center and is in the Berkeley area. And their whole point is to make art accessible to lay practitioners. And what we started doing is branching out into offering digital storytelling workshops and services to not just the community, but are really starting to work with the education community, and many different stakeholders can benefit from this. So they're really starting to translate this concept of digital storytelling into something that can be widely accessible throughout many different genres. So as we were talking about, arts-based knowledge mobilization and taken off over the past decade. Not just digital storytelling, but also dance, poetry, body mapping, theater. They're all being used to generate data about research topics, including, I know that, and Graham, you registered on this call, one of one of our principal investigators is actually pitching or has pitched a based project for one of our projects. So it's definitely coming to the forefront. There's a lot more creative expression happening in research, and it's happening for a reason. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a sec. Um, so it very effective in the co-creative research process and decentralizing the hierarchies around research, and that sort of, the top dog being the PI and all the other researchers sort of, under that and falling in line with basic just data and writing. It actually really has become an empowering tool for our HQP and YP. You can produce a lot of rich data, especially around ethnography, especially in ways that when I say rich data, I mean people invest more when they feel empowered, more energy, so the quality of the research starts to go up. It created an effective and accessible knowledge mobilization that's really specific to non-academic stakeholders, but it doesn't necessarily have to be limited to academic stakeholders. I think what I've found since I've been doing this with GWF is that we've had many academic stakeholders start to take interest in how to engage digital storytelling on their big data projects, ways that they can explain very complex processes and easy 2 to 5 minute sort of sound bites that can communicate to audiences for things like presentations and workshops at annual general meetings and operations meetings, and community presentations. Story Center says that digital stories are therapeutic, educative, movement building, and have a great deal of research potential. So I want to talk a bit about research. I mean, as we know, research is this iterative process, advances on itself. It's publicly funded, meaning it has to be freely accessible because of that. And the goal is to be impactful and rewarding. We're doing research for a reason most of the time. Some of the barriers and challenges in research is that there is a resistance to methods other than traditional publication. Oftentimes, arts, quote unquote, based projects can be kind of seen as a little bit maybe on the fringe. And there's this fear of misrepresentation. There's also a fear of oversimplifying really complex processes. This can result in a break in between stakeholders and researchers because of that sort of inaccessibility, that sort of dryness that might come or an academic publication. And it makes our findings invisible, and this is the uptake of our knowledge, that knowledge translation. So that's really where knowledge mobilizers come in, and what those knowledge mobilization plans are meant for is to address how are you going to engage your stakeholders? How are you truly going to communicate how this project is not only what the findings were, but how is it evolving along the way? We want people to take up this knowledge. We're not asking for letters of support and working with partners in name only. We really want to engage our communities in this work. This is where digital stories and video can actually, as one mode of, can be one mode of solving this issue. So I'm sure everybody has what a digital story is. I'm sure that you've probably seen many of them at this point, but just to give a brief background, and the Story Center really, who kind of innovated this process, they define digital story as an audio-visual narrative that combines still photographs, video. It can have digital media and animation, music, sound, obviously voiceovers, and interviews. They can be very complex. They can be very simple. They're mainly told from the first person. Usually there is some sort of narrative built into them to tell a bit of a story. They're very short. As I said, they're 2 to 5 minutes. They often can be created by community partners that you're working with. This might be a way to do a community digital storytelling workshop that really engages your community partners and youth in ways that translate the project's process and really engaging them in the project in ways that maybe they hadn't intended. YPs are often taking up and doing digital stories. I'll share one in just a bit. HQP for sure, doing digital stories, water futures. And once in a while, we'll see a PI even doing a digital story. Um, and they really can be, and I encourage you to do digital stories at any time during the arc of your project. So right from the very beginning. And what you can see is this beautiful string of progress of digital stories and progress over the funding period of the project. And by the end, you'll just see this beautiful cachet of a narrative about how your project was created and evolved and what the results were at the end. So it builds this really great cumulative narrative over a period of time that is really worth gold sometimes, especially when you want to tell the story about and have sort of some immediately accessible proof of how your project really engaged a community. So again, just a little bit more about what digital stories are. Short really is the operative term. We really don't like seeing digital stories going beyond 3 minutes, although we have seen them go often longer than that. If you start to see a digital story get a little bit more than 5 minutes, you might want to see what can be broken down into separate bits, and maybe that means that it's more than one digital story. They're often told person, and it's usually an experiential sharing of what's been going on in the project or one aspect of the project. They're these brief narrative pieces that create a combination of recorded narratives and images. You can screen grab images as well as comments. You can do that. Obviously, taking things that you've been doing in the field on your phone and just, keeping them and using them as you go along your project. They can be quite accessible as far as just doing pretty much every part of it on your phone or on your laptop. You don't need any special equipment. You don't need any special, expensive, hard to learn applications. You can really do this just, and Denise will be the person to really attest to that. You don't need any special skill to create a digital story. They can be quite transformative. The visual, a visual project is something that really communicates directly to all your senses in some ways. So it really, instead of just reading, you're really seeing this story that communicates in a very brief period of time, very specific point on a project. And it's usually about some specific aspect of your project. So it's not usually about the project as a whole, unless it's just a really brief overview. Digital stories are really meant to sort of drill into some of the granular details and some of the personal narratives and specific aspects of a project. So in the case for Denise, it was a language piece for this project. So it's a pretty cool video. I'm excited to do. So this is the first example of a digital story, and this is the one we were talking about. This is by Aubrey Wake, who's part of our Global Water Futures. She's part of the Mountain Water Futures Project, and I hope that you can hear this. I'm pretty sure you'll be able to, but this is one example of a project that, or a piece where you normally wouldn't, it's considered sort of a hard science piece. So it's not, it's not an ethnography talking about something that people were wondering, can you do a digital story about this? So this is Carolyn's piece, and I just want to let it speak for itself. All right. Um, that was pretty cute. So, let me just get back to full screen. Maybe I'm okay. So that was a kind of an interesting project, and didn't actually do a voiceover, but what she did was she wrote all of her um, she wrote the whole thing. So instead of doing a voiceover, she just wrote it on that little whiteboard and did a kind of a stop motion animation. It's pretty interesting. It definitely is a first person narrative, but it came in the form of handwriting, which I thought was pretty creative, but her voice was still there. It was still a first person narrative. And it was communicating a basic concept about what her research is about meltwater and about forecasting and modeling and what this is going to look like, what what that will look like in the future. Um, so that was an interesting, and it was very fun. Everybody really liked it. I think she sent that in for a contest that she was doing. So that could be something that comes up, is instead of just doing a basic or a publication, to think about like how can I also create some narrative pieces around this project. So some of the challenges I want to just talk a little bit about, as I had said before, the benefits are that digital stories can reach quite wide audiences. Often what we do is we'll upload them on YouTube, as you saw, and if you have them meditate and you're really looking at like writing a good description for your digital story, folks who are just searching those search might land on your project and have no idea that it was even happening. So that's a pretty interesting way to people can really come out of left field and contact you about your project, and there could be potential for building interesting collaborations and partnerships that may not have existed before. um, really increases your exposure, the exposure to your research, which is really valuable, especially if it's people are looking for more information on specific aspects of research. Say in journalism, it could really connect you in that way, which can elevate the visibility of your research projects. It highlights these findings through very accessible knowledge translation. It's really quite simple. I feel like Carol's project was a great example of that, where it made this sort of basic understanding of what her project is about very accessible versus reading a project proposal or a white paper or an academic paper, to just really try to get the gist of what her project is about. That told a very brief and interesting and engaging story. Digital stories, anything I found, are great for collaboration and meaningful collaboration and building really meaningful relationships with your community partners. There's this idea of story circles that happen in digital storytelling, where we do these workshops where we get folks together and they aspects of what they want to do, and we'll go through the whole process together. We'll storyboard everything. We'll go through and then we'll come back and we'll look at the drafts of our digital stories and really see together, talk about what the process has been like, and talk about what we would want to change, and do feedback and critique. And within that process, our community members start to really build relationships with one another and build relationships with the HQP and PIs and other folks on the project. So there's this great bridge. Digital stories can really act as a bridge between stakeholders, partners, and researchers, and in some really great ways. And that's something that back and forth as well. So it becomes a really wonderful way to kind of get out of the mindset of that dry sort of mechanical process of research. It can be very therapeutic and so folks who like Denise is probably one of those folks who has had that experience, being able to really reflect on what her research is about and what her interests are about, and by going through the process of learning and doing, she did learn something that really informed her life in some ways that I think helped you in many ways. it does have an impact on the wider community, especially in marginalized communities who don't feel seen or heard. So there's this oftentimes, even like a community screening of the digital stories is a great fun way to celebrate some of the milestones in the research project and to really communicate to community members who aren't engaged that the research happening in their community is beneficial and gives them an understanding of what might be going on. It does illustrate complex concepts in a very clear and appealing way. Um, you can do things from like that stop motion sort of thing and animation, still photographs, um, writing, just, one-on-one interview, but it does illustrate things in a way that you have to be very concise, decisive about how and efficient with your time and your language when you have a time limit of 2 to 3 minutes. And it really does inspire interest in the innovation of research beyond academia. So it's become a game changer in some ways for how research moving forward, especially when we're really uplifting this idea of co-creative research. And I just want to pause for one moment to share what that means for those who don't know. So co-creative research is sort of the next evolution or next level of what we would normally call action research, where you're working with community stakeholders in ways that involved in that research in some way. So co-creative research, well, I'll say this, participatory action research is usually by the researchers, and there's this concept of inclusion of a community in that research. And there's, some, maybe on the land camps or science STEM days and that kind of thing. And that's all well and good. And I think those are really valuable. But what co-creative research is that it takes that and it ups the ante to include the community from the very beginning, from the inception of a proposal. So really thinking about a proposal and a research project from the perspective of the community, and involving the community and community in the drafting of a research question, and then coming up together with the proposal and submitting that together. And so really being involved from A to Z in a research project. That's really what co-creative research is. And this is one way out of many that actually become a very beneficial way to include the community voice. So I just want to share a couple challenges as you're moving into this space of co-creative research and creating digital stories, is to be careful, especially with marginalized communities, be careful not to traumatize or re-traumatize people. So if you're doing ethnography, if you're doing something that, like we do a lot of water quality research, which sounds very dry, but when you think about working with an indigenous community, for example, who has a boil water advisory, or has not had accessible drinking water or clean drinking water for, for Six Nations, it's been 20 years that they've had active boil water advisories happening. That can be quite traumatizing or re-traumatizing, because it's really drilling into some of the reasons for why that access isn't available. Or some of the harm that may have been caused by not having clean drinking water, some of the illnesses. And so just be aware of that, be mindful of that. There's also limitation to technology. So we have to make sure that if we're engaging a community in a digital storytelling project, that we're actually providing the technology to that community, and we're providing access in their community, not just maybe say here at the university or a research site, but actually somewhere where folks can actually get to. So making sure that we have appropriate access to technology is really, really important. You can't tell a digital story if you don't have a phone or a computer to tell it with. So making sure that you have funding sort of flagged in your project for whether it's a laptop or a computer or some other device in order to be able to do that work is important. Be aware of developing these negative narratives that might be stigmatizing or stereotyping of the community. These are things that you don't want folks to tell a story and for you to drive the story in a certain way in order to be to illustrate something about a community. One way of putting that would be, I use the indigenous example because that's my role. I'm an Indigenous knowledge mobilizer. So I work with Indigenous communities. So I'll just keep using that as an example. But in this example, we want to make sure that the narratives that people are telling are positive and that we're focused on resilience, that we're not focused on deficits or the negatives of a community. There's this idea of sharing a negative or narrative that as a community in a way that really can stigmatize people, and that will disengage a community if they feel shame or if they feel embarrassed about the narrative that they're sharing. We want to celebrate the resilience of our communities and the interest and the what they're invested in, what they're living for right now in this project. So I suggest that you really work with the knowledge mobilization specialist doing this work if you're not one yourself, to be able to translate some of these things and also to translate that hard science data into accessible language within that project. We want our stakeholders and the people who are creating these digital stories to drive these projects, but we can be there right at their side to just sort of direct them and guide them to make sure that we're telling them in a way that everybody can understand. So some of the non-academic stakeholders that have benefited from and we've gotten great feedback from regarding digital stories have been businesses, just businesses that are, that benefit from, whether it's ski areas, for example, on the West Coast, who are starting to really benefit from some of global water forecasting and modeling research in the Mountain Water Futures Project, for example. Policymakers, it's a great way to be able to really engage policymakers in a way that gets them to really understand an issue that is living for a community. It's very important to them, and in a concise and way that can pull emotion, it can pull need to take action. Obviously, NGOs, not-for-profits, really not only do they digital stories, it could also be a way to help these this is with limited funding. You don't have a lot of funding to be able to communicate what your project, your not-for-profit is about. This could be a really wonderful tool for not-for-profits to be able to help them in their work. And not public are great stakeholders, people who are getting interested in whether they're activists or people who are community researchers, or maybe they haven't seen or thought about an aspect of research. So just the general public, it's great to be able to communicate what's going on in this research world, and it can be very inspiring and really incite some action. So the values and principles of digital storytelling, I think it's important to share these in basic ways so that we can really understand where we're coming from. Everybody has many powerful stories. I think oftentimes when we're working with our community members, I think there's this initial sort of like they just blank out and they're like, what do I have a story to tell about? What should I be doing? I don't have anything to share. And then you've got the creative ball rolling in the process of like really teasing out some of the stories that might come out of a project and from their own experience, and they just kind of go on it's almost like a snowball effect, and those folks have been some of the folks who have actually produced the most content and also some of the most interesting content. Listening is also very deeply challenging, so it's really interesting to see that bi-directional process storytelling and then story listening. So it gives people an undivided attention. So you can play your story and people will listen to it without any interruption and really take that in. Whereas if you're just sharing something in a community meeting, for example, about a research project, during a community engagement project, it's a little bit easier to just check out, kind of want to ask questions instead of listening or hearing. So, and also people see, hear, and perceive in different ways. They're constantly taking in new information. We all take it in differently. And audiovisual narrative is a really easy way and accessible way to engage folks who might not be able to understand academic jargon. Creativity is a human, it's a human aspect that we all have, whether we know we not. We all have some creative potential in us, and it can be quite transformative for folks who are used to just writing, writing, to actually pull out a piece of their creativity and put it on display for our partners. I think is um, refresh and renew your interest in being a researcher sometimes, and I've definitely gotten that feedback. Technology is definitely a powerful creative tool. It's something that even just since last year, the innovations and the applications that we're using for digital stories are changing all the time. The way that we communicate and share those stories are changing very, very rapidly, and things are so much more accessible than they were even 2 years ago. And sharing stories can always positive change if they're told in a way that is engaging and responsible and respectful and meaningful. Stories can change the world. So some of the basic concepts to start thinking about as you're starting to consider using digital stories in your projects are, going with those basics: what, who, why, and how. So what is the new knowledge or key finding you're hoping to disseminate? Really start thinking about this as you're starting to consider what stories, what do you want to mobilize? What is the knowledge that you're having? Maybe you have a block in your project where you're just not sure how to tell, communicate part of your project. What's the impact of your finding? What will this finding actually, is it going to shift or change the research community? How is it going to shift or change your field in some way? How does it add to that iterative data that is being compiled together? Who's going to be able to build off of it? And that leads us to, who are your stakeholders and partners? Who are you trying to influence? Um, so, who are your community partners? Think about, when you're writing your knowledge mobilization plans, um, most generalized, but who are the people that you are engaging in this work, and what would they like to see happen? Hopefully, you're doing that in the beginning as you're writing your proposals, but really trying to figure out what would they like to see happen, and how would you like to engage them? Who are you trying to? Um, are they receptive to alternative methods of disseminating your research finding? This may work for some stakeholders, and for others it may be a big no. They may see it as something, like we were saying in the beginning, is watering research, or maybe misinterpreting that data. You might want to you know sell them on the fact that it might not do that. There are times where a digital story is not going to be the best way to convey the findings of your data. I don't want to say that these are going to work for everything. um, but I do feel like if you're working with community members, and as we saw with Carolyn's story, you can be working with hard data and still tell a story. But you know, you may do digital stories and only share them with parts of your community or parts of your stakeholders. Um, will will the people you're working with actually help to disseminate this as well? Are they going to share this on their social? Like, you can share it on YouTube and then it can just sit there and not be viewed, or you can really engage through a communications plan, a way to get this through your partners as well. This, maybe even going viral, who knows? And obviously, do you have permission from your community or your stakeholders and partners to actually share this information and share their story? And then we'll move into the why. Why do you your specific want to share this specific information with your stakeholders? Is there some specific aspect that would be useful or valuable to them? Is it in alignment with your research proposal and your inception documents? Is it actually in alignment with what you plan to do with your project, or is it a diversion in some way? And then how are you going to be going about disseminating your story? There are many to be able to get your digital story out into the community and out into the world. The easiest way is through social, we're finding, but you can also throw things in a newsletter. You can embed things in MailChimp newsletters and lots of different newsletters. We're starting to play around with some podcasting right now, which is definitely becoming more more popular by the day, and blogs, websites, things like that. I will encourage you, however, to make sure that you embed everything from a single origin so that you can measure the, the viewing and the engagement of your digital story. So the best way to do that would be to engage something like YouTube that you can pull code from and embed into a web. It's all coming from the same link, from the same story, so that you can go in and when you're doing your annual reporting, uh, pull the metrics from YouTube to show what the original views were and the repeat views were and where the viewings are happening. Good stuff. Um, some things to consider, some additional things to consider. Make your audience directly and personally. Just speak to your audience as if you were speaking to them right here in the room. You know, really, it makes sense for you to like speak to them and engage them directly in a way that really connects in a way that doesn't normally come through in a really high academic-y sounding research paper. You know, maybe you can't go to Whitehorse to engage the communities there, but you can certainly send them a link to a digital story and they can see your face or they can hear your voice. They can see some of the stuff that's going on, some of the progress of a project, and that really can get folks excited. Make sure to communicate the motivation and context of your project's goal. Just give some rationale around what you're doing, why you're doing it, what are some of the goals that you're hoping, and how will that benefit the community. Um, Showcase the relevant impacts and examples of your project. So, you know, really showcasing some of the things that are again like going to benefit that stakeholder. What are the reasons that a stakeholder signed on to a project? What are the reasons a community signed on to a project? Make sure you're showcasing those things and the progress of those pieces. You want to put emphasis on the practical value of your research for society, the economy, and the environment. Whatever this practical aspect of your research is, we want to make sure that we're communicating things in a very simple way. Again, you know, these are 2 to 3 minute stories. So you don't really have time for anything frivolous or extraneous. You're really communicating in a very direct and concise way. And again, you want to share and disseminate your digital story widely to make sure that you gather those metrics to really see how it truly is engaging. So I'm going to talk a little bit now with Denise McQueen and share with her. She's going to share with you a little bit about her project. Would you have the video shown now or after?
We can do it after.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll talk first.
All right.
Yeah.
So I want to say again, thank you to Denise. Hi,
Hi.
for being here. So
No
this
problem.
is kind of the podcasty part of
Okay.
our workshop, I guess. We're going to be doing a lot more podcasts at Global Water Futures, which I think is a really fun, engaging way of talking about research, the research process. So, Denise, do you want to tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and what
Sure.
project you were involved with?
I was involved with co-creation Indigenous water quality tools with McMaster, GWF, and Six Nations territory. I was a community navigator, so my main role was to assist the scientific teams and the chemical engineering teams to come to community to gather samples. So it's really important to have a community member facilitate meetings. So as a part of the project, we were asked to create a digital story. The only criteria that we had was related to water. Um, the project that I created and the digital story that I created kind of highlights my passion and what my interests were. Is I'm a second language Mohawk learner and speaker, and I found throughout that a lot of people talked a lot about Indigenous knowledge and what is, you know, the connection that the Indigenous people, the reciprocal relationships that they have with water, and what does that actually look like. And we can talk about it all the time, but I wanted to kind of explain it traditionally, not traditionally, but explain it from a perspective of language, because I think a lot of our knowledge and a lot of our gifts that we have are lost in translation from their original Indigenous language to English. Kind of wanted to scale it back a little bit and create more of an educational piece for the non-Indigenous people that were a part of the project to fully understand what exactly our relationship to water looks like. So the exciting part about the digital story is speaking a language is one thing, but especially with this language, Mohawk specifically, is such a descriptive language that it was really important for me to try and find the perfect video to align with some of the language to create a picture because our language is three-dimensional and alive. So I want to convey that aspect as well when creating a digital story. So it was really exciting for me to do this because it's not very often I get to put a photograph next to a word that I know that invokes an emotion for me from a cultural perspective. So it was really exciting for me, and I'm really happy the way it turned out. I excited to share
I'm excited too.
it.
Can you tell us a little bit about the person in the
Oh
video?
yes, Dehahande. He is his traditional name is Dehahande. He likes to be referred to as that, so that's what I listed him as in the video. It's just an interview because he's an advanced level speaker and very knowledgeable about our culture and traditions. So I decided to interview him to give a little context and to the translation from Mohawk language to English. He could do, in my opinion, he's a mentor of mine, so I thought it would pay justice to um, his language learning and as well. So he lives on Six Nations, and again, he's advanced speaker, and he participates culturally in our traditional longhouse. So he's a well-respected community member.
Wonderful.
Hmm.
And I remember you going through the process of creating this story.
Yeah.
And so were you in any way involved with digital storytelling or
No,
video production before this?
I have absolutely no technological skill whatsoever.
Okay.
Um, but I did find it interesting when you were speaking earlier and you spoke to the fact that a lot of marginalized communities don't feel like they have a voice in the sense that they don't feel like what they have to say is very important
Mhm.
because that's kind of been the, um, I guess, reality that they live in sometimes. When we were asked to create a story, I'm like, what do we talk about? I don't know what to talk about. But through the process of doing a storyboard and having conversations and looking at other digital stories, I thought, well, maybe I kind of wanted to make it an educational video, but not to educate in the sense that I'm going to preach to you about something or teach you. I wanted you to just feel it and see it from
Mhm.
our perspective, and in my opinion, and is the only way to do that is through language. So it was an interesting process because I had never used I did this video just on my MacBook with the iMovie. I've never actually created anything like this before. It took me a long time only because I wanted it to be perfect. I had to source out the pictures and so that took me a little bit longer than I expected, but that was my own issue because these words invoke a reaction with me and I want to be able to convey that. So I time to finding the actual right pictures and songs and
Mhm.
stuff like that. So, but it was fairly easy and it was exciting, and I see how easy it is. I'm looking forward to doing more of them with future projects that I'm working on. So I'm glad I was a part of it. Yeah.
One. And has the community viewed this story?
Yeah. So, in a community perspective, a part of this project is I created one, but also engaged the youth in this project as well. The youth that go to the immersion school, so they're immersed in the language and culture as well. So we asked three different grade levels to create kind of like the same idea of what water meant to them from a cultural perspective. So I was really excited to be a part of that as well because the kids were they all had the information, the same kind of training, I guess, so they felt empowered, and it was really exciting for them because we got to see it at several community events, so they felt like their voice was heard in a sense of like they didn't I don't think they really understood what that actually looked like from a research perspective, but for them it was really super exciting to see their voice and hear their voice on the big screen. So it was, and they were engaged, so they're really excited about the water project that's been taking place, and they feel like they're important, and they feel like the culture and language that they've been immersed in for their most of them like their entire school life actually has a place somewhere now. So,
Wonderful.
hmm
All right, well,
hmm
let's
sure.
story.
So this is the Mohawk language. I just want to clarify that's the language that Dehahande is speaking. It's the Mohawk language.
Okay.
or gun.
Nagadi dana wa yaga ane dayada ane garu yage wa nyo kahunzi no undo hetste yoga das hetste no no wa igweni wa utkato no ayiro nek nega iga nega tzi unza kweko ne ka horne o nega nas. So Sky Woman comes from the sky world. She goes through this dark tunnel first. When she emerges from the dark tunnel, that was her first words that she said, Nikne Ohnega Iga. So when she lands here on the back of the turtle, that represents the end came up. It needed the earth to propagate life. So again, in where she sent the animals to bring life up in the form of earth to put on the turtle's back. So when they say Gatni Garunya, and others will say Gandhataraha, which means that these waters are up, they're elevated. What that means is they're connected with the rain. So then they say Gahniganor. So why is the water pressure? We all, when it's raining, yoga nor, yoga zi ganor. It's visibly precious how we talk about the rain. So when that comes down, everything needs, the plants need the water to grow. The animals need the water. We need the water. Over 70% of your body is made up of water as well. So that's the reason why water is so precious, because it supports life. And even when scientists go to other, they send their rocket ships up looking for other, that's the first thing that they look for. They look for water, because they know water and is associated where there's water, there's going to be life form, some one form or another.
That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So breaking that down a little bit, before we get into how to create a digital story, just breaking down that video a bit, I can see a couple different aspects of it that I really love, is how effective it is, not only in giving the community and empowering the community to tell stories that matter to them within the scope of a project, but also really communicating the community and the community's way of through the community's lens. It's really in communicating the indigenous worldview, right?
And a lot of that, in my opinion, is in the language.
Yes, absolutely. And to be able to convey something in the Mohawk language it's such a unique language, and it really is a lens into the worldview, is that you can really start to see that this specific community and the Mohawk people value water in a way that is very connected, and it's very much about a relationship.
Yeah, and with water, and with language, like the way that the Mohawk language works, it's such a descriptive language, and it's an old language. So when you actually break the words down and look at what they actually translate to, in our perspective, you're actually looking, in my opinion, the way for me was that you're actually looking at something that somebody else viewed hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Like my ancestors created that word, so literally what they saw. So when I find out the information behind words like yoga noro, it's visibly precious to me. That hits a chord because I'm like, that's somebody thought that of the rain.
Right.
Like we didn't have words for rain, obviously. That those are English terms, but I mean that's what they saw and that's what they felt. So it connects me on an emotional level to my ancestors in a way that could never happen if I'm reading our history in a textbook in English.
Right. And is additionally coming from the perspective of telling this as a story to a community and about the viewer and who you're telling this story to, you know that this is you're reflecting and holding a mirror up to the community and yourself, but you're also holding up this concept of a portrait to the researcher and to your Western or stakeholders and researchers. What like really what is the value that as a community? What is the worldview that you're looking through? They're able to understand more about you and your needs and what your desires as a stakeholder, I guess. So it's really getting them to be able to embody something that maybe couldn't come across with just doing a community engagement meeting.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And especially when it comes to water, a lot of people are unaware of the fact that the water is in our creation story in the very beginning, and it plays out through everything that we embody and speak of, and our entire way of being. There's always a connection, like I said earlier, a reciprocal connection to water, and we do talk a lot about that, and we do protest, and we do, defend our water, but I just level of like, what does that actually mean? Why? Where's our why?
Yeah.
Right.
And that, I remember when Dr. Martin came up with this proposal and did community engagement meetings about the co-creation for Indigenous Water Quality Tools project. And one of the ways that she communicated to the community why she wanted to do this project was so that she could convey to Western research how precious water is to Indigenous people, and that we have a way of seeing the world that science can benefit from. And I think this is one way of translating that knowledge and back and forth between community and researcher. So I feel like it was a very successful digital story.
Yeah, absolutely. Because how else is somebody that doesn't speak the language going to be able to get this information? It's just not something that, unless you know the language yourself, you're not going to be able to find it that easily.
So that being said, how did you find the process of going through creating your story?
Creating it was a little bit of a learning curve. I'd never used the programming before, even though it is a simple program compared to some of the other programs that are available. But it was a learning curve for me. But I enjoyed it, and I was excited about it when I started seeing it come together. I was really pleased with it and happy with it. I spent a lot of time on it, even though it's only 3 minutes, a little over 3 minutes. I spent a lot of time on it. My family knows it off by heart because I wanted it, because I'm so passionate about the language and our culture, and I knew what this was going to represent. I wanted it to be my best. So I might have spent more time than probably required, but it worked out, in my opinion, worked out really well.
I think that really speaks to this idea that, oftentimes we have partners and stakeholders who are sort of in name only or not fully engaged. And when you don't have somebody who's fully engaged in the process and just sort of going through the motions of the research, I think that really can dilute the quality of the data and the research that's coming through. And it's one way I think of, especially in this project, we needed a lot of community support and community buy-in to this project because people are sort of side-eyeing, especially in marginalized communities. Folks often do not trust researchers. They don't really want to engage. And if they do, it has to have a benefit. So this is a way of really kind of pulling the community in and from a way that I feel this illustrates really well. This is giving you a voice and there's building trust. There's definitely, I think, over the 3 years that Dr. Martin Hill's project has happened or been going on in 6 nations, the community trust is built up enough that folks are really becoming engaged and not and investing their time and energy into this project that may not have happened had we not been engaging accessible media and accessible ways to translate that knowledge.
Absolutely, and because of that specific project, it is so wide and different areas that content that they're working on. It's really important to engage the language community. It was really, really important. So this was one way to highlight and give voice to the depth of the relationship that we live when we're living from our languages, right?
And I think from this perspective as well, one of the aspects that we like to talk about with co-creative research and with this process, that this is the community telling a story, right? This is the community driving the voice of the project and driving some of the deliverables of the project. That doesn't necessarily have to be. It could also be including the researchers who are non-Indigenous or not a part of the community, or so there's stakeholders.
Like vice versa, it could go either way.
And they're all different facets and aspects and angles of the same project. So I just think that's really, it's been proving to be very valuable and very useful.
Yeah.
So I just want to say thank you for being
welcome.
here. I appreciate it. Is there anything else you want to share before you?
No, I just hope everybody enjoyed it, and yeah, I don't think there's anything else I need to add. If anybody had any questions regarding the language or the content, they can always reach out to me. I'm always open to discussing it further.
You have to go, right?
Yeah,
okay.
I do.
So maybe we can open up, if anybody has a couple questions to ask Denise before Denise leaves, we can do those now, and then we can save the other aspects of the Q&A until the end. Is that okay?
That's fine. Yeah,
okay.
That's
Does
fine.
anybody have any questions to ask Denise? Sounds like no, because I can't hear anybody talking unless you're muted. It sounds like everybody's
that's absolutely fine.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Denise.
Oh, you're welcome.
It's great to see you, and
you.
I'm just really proud of you. I think that really turned out well.
Oh, thank you.
All right. So the next part of this is to, just the basic steps to create your own digital story. So we've been talking about this idea that it is not rocket surgery to create a digital story. It's very very accessible and an easy, quick way to to build a narrative about your project. So there are some basic steps that will help you facilitate this process, so you're not just sort of throwing spaghetti at a wall and seeing what sticks. You can actually, there's a little bit of a method to the madness. And so the first would be to obviously generate the idea. So this is a way, just do your whatever brainstorm, brain mapping, mind mapping way that you like to generate ideas. Just start writing down ideas, really figuring out what are the things that are popping out to you, what are the things that you want to communicate to the stakeholder, who are, like we said, figure out who your stakeholders are, figure out who the audience is going to be, how are you going to share it, figure out all that stuff first. And then when you really feel solid about who you're talking to, how you want to talk with them, the way that you're going to disseminate it, what it is that you want to figure out what is this idea that you want to communicate. And it might be just one idea that comes at first, but believe me, it'll snow once you start generating those ideas. So just try not to be too broad. Try to be granular, pretty specific. And if it feels like it's getting too big, then you might want to see where the overlap between, can you break that into two parts? Is there, if ideas start to get too broad or you think that it would be too long, maybe you have a couple ideas embedded in one idea. Then you want to start, you really always want to work from a script of some kind. So start, looking at, maybe you already written some academic papers on this concept and you want to communicate one of those papers into a digital story or a couple. So that would be your opportunity to pull from your already published or written research, or one pager, or even a proposal, and really start to flesh that out and start writing. If you publish, use your abstract and your conclusion, just really, we're not looking for too much detail, but just really good, concise overview of whatever your idea is. Then you want to storyboard your script into something that, and I'll share what the storyboard looks like on the next slide. Really working in a visual sense what you want your digital story to look like. So this is an opportunity to, a good artist. It's literally, you can use an application. There are tons of them online. I'm going to share a couple resources at the end that actually you can go to to download an app for a different storyboard and digital story applications. But to be honest, I feel like just paper and pen can really be valuable, useful, very low tech, accessible way to just make sure that you're following a concise timeline for your digital story. And these are really the different shots. It looks kind of like a comic book together that shows this transition of frame to frame of the opening scene all the way, and through the interviews and or different images and the narrative that you're telling, and then the conclusion. And then obviously we'd like to build in some credits and thanks, and if you have logos and that kind of thing to add, those would all go in as well. And then you're going to start collecting those elements like your logos. Make sure that you're collecting video along the way of your project and keeping those in a special folder maybe that is marked for digital storytelling. All the audio interviews and audio, like Denise included music in her video, that was really effective and useful. This is really a chance for you to shine in a fun way. And then also any legal documentation is really important to collect. And that would be if you're looking at doing interviews with human beings and they're talking, you want to make sure that you're getting consents to release their images, that they're consenting to use this video. And you can work with your communication services offices to be able to create a consent to that image and make sure that it's based from both your university and if you're working for a university as well as or if it's a corporation that you're working for, make sure that you're just doing your due diligence in that way. And then when you're all done with all of that, you think that it would just be so simple for a 2 to 3 minute digital story, but it takes quite a while to just get all those out. Then you want to build it, and this is really the fun part. It can be a little bit overwhelming at first, but it's really, you'll find yourself spending hours and hours and hours on something that takes 2 to 3 minutes just because you want to make it look just perfect and sound good, line up. And but I don't want to intimidate you either, because really you can use an app on your phone. You literally can make a digital story from A to Z just on your phone if you have a smartphone. You can use Final Cut Pro, but that takes a lot of learning and a lot of technological access, and Final Cut Pro is expensive. So, unless you know how to edit video, I would suggest you can even just go right onto YouTube and edit right in YouTube now. There's so many accessible ways to build a digital story, but you just use your phone's own video editor. And if you want to, and you can use one on your laptop as well. There's QuickTime, there's Movie, depending on what OS you're using. And then once you're all done and you feel like it's perfect and you've shared it with a couple people and had some critical feedback and made some adjustments, then you're ready to share your digital story. And as I mentioned, the one piece of advice I would share is that you're sharing it to initially upload it to a YouTube channel so that you have a way to just have a central location from which to copy and embed code, whether it's into a newsletter or if it's just being able to send a link so that you can easily access it while you're showing it at a conference or an event. It really is one of the easiest and quickest ways and most efficient ways to share and track the viewing of a digital story. All right, what's going on with my? Okay, so this is an image of what a storyboard can look like. So this is a really basic one, and it's just pen and paper, no fancy apps, no fancy technology. It's literally just taking it from a script and telling a story in a linear process. So it's really showing you what are the milestones in your digital story? What are the milestones you want to make sure that you're sharing with people? And it can help you really more efficient in the way that you're telling the story as well. Because if you start to really, build up a storyboard that's like pages and pages long, that's probably going to, be a lot longer than 2 to 3 minutes. So, you don't have to share every single frame transition. You're just really looking at the milestones as you build that storyboard. It's pretty simple. So this is the easiest way to do a storyboard, but you can also download applications. You can use Microsoft Word, whatever you feel like using. You can use PowerPoint. And that is one way also that you can share a digital story. You can use different applications in video, and you can also do it in PowerPoint and sort of embed video into that as well. So just thinking about it from sort of the maybe a little bit more perspective, you want to think about creating a digital story that's really visually engaging. What are the aspects of telling a story? So the potential of a good story comes from the telling of it. Really, it needs to have a rhythm and a cadence. You want to build up to something. You want to sort of resolve it, or bring it to a conclusion. You want to have it follow sort of the basic timeline of a narrative. You want to think about composition. You want to think about, what kind of sound you're going to include. Where is the light coming from? I know Denise me and her digital story, that was all natural lighting. There was no ring light or any fancy lighting involved. She just had the subject sit in front of a window, and that was just natural lighting falling on him. You want to think about movement. Are is there, especially with water, for example, water is in so many different forms, and one of them is in a moving form, and running water and dripping water, and so all these things that are going to engage your audience and what's going to really make the experience a rich and engaging experience. And also the voice. Whose voice is it? What is the voice that you're trying to convey? Are you speaking? Are you, like in Carolyn Aubrey Wake's aspect, she was writing things down, but there was still that first person voice. Really take into account, maybe take a look at some that are out there and just make note of the things that you like about them. Are they really focused on specific colors? Are they focusing more on the content of sharing information? What is it that stands out to you, to this digital stories that you're viewing? And then what makes an image good? This is always a great idea to think about when you're building a digital story and you're doing you're composing an image in a frame. It's a moving image. You can also use still images, but you really want to think about the more visually engaging an image is, the more an audience will be pulled to actually continue to watch your story. So think about some of the aspects of composition and what draws in an audience. So think of things like line and shape and form and texture and pattern and color. Obviously, composition. This is a great example. This image that I'm showing you here, that could have been taken many different ways, but conveys a very specific emotion, a specific feeling by looking at it. If the photographer had focused on the person standing hallway versus pulling focus onto this cracked piece of glass, the image would have looked very different. This to me is conveying sort of a foreboding feeling, a feeling of maybe some threat or some sort of yeah, like it's not a fun image to look at. It's very compelling, and it could have looked very different had the person been in focus. So just thinking about that, thinking, even like this is a black and white image, for example, what would it have looked like had it been in color? What would it have looked like had you seen the person's face in focus? And then finally, when you're done with, really thinking about and considering and crafting your story and putting it all together, again, you want to make sure you're sharing your story and considering, again, I keep hammering this home, but I do it for a good reason, especially when you're thinking about annual report and really pulling metrics for your data. Consider using a single source to disseminate your story, and make sure that there are measurable ways to see how many people are viewing it and where they're viewing it from and that kind of thing. Make sure that, and make sure more than one time that you have permission to share people's likenesses. So maybe somebody agreed to tell their digital story in the beginning of a community project and they signed off the paperwork, but you have to remember that consent is actually something that is a continuous and evolving thing. So maybe you've lost some, you've been building relationships and you've been developing these digital stories, and then for some reason the community pulls out of the project. You sure that you're still able to share that story. So it is something that you want to continuously make sure that you have consent. Again, you want to be grateful to the partners and the funders who have supported the project. So make sure that you have all their logos and make sure that you add some space and time into your digital story at the end to thank those partners. So that's about it for the crafting of it. We are going to be Global Water Futures for our YP and HQP. For any of you listening, half-day training that will be more of a digital story lab. That's where we're going to actually pull together a group of folks from all of our research sites and spend a half day actually creating digital stories and doing a little bit of that story circle that I was talking about before, where we can really look at each other's stories and critique and analyze and connect with one another. So I wanted to share a couple, and you're going to get these slides, everybody, so don't worry about that. But these are some links to some of the resources that we can provide, or I've looked at. I don't want to make a huge list because I know folks are probably writing and stuff. You can click on these links, and these are ones that I vetted. So one for storyboarding software, and then some video apps for both iPhone and I believe the other one includes some Android. And I want to talk just a tiny bit about this idea, this resource called IFT. IFT is a way of taking all of your social media and sort of mobilizing it all at the same time. So you don't have to go to Twitter and then Facebook and then Instagram for every single thing and post things 3 times. You can actually engage IFT to do all of that all at once. So it makes it very easy and very, sort of at your fingertips way of disseminating those stories across all social media platforms. So I just want to conclude before we do some Q&A that I've found as a knowledge mobilizer, there really is a lot of value in creating digital stories in research to generate. So we've seen a lot of digital stories in the arts and media environment and community, but it really does go beyond. This is a tool that we can use to communicate to people in a way that it really elicits deep listening, a deeper understanding of our research. It also creates data specifically compared to traditional interviews. And also researchers and participants still more time and but because these take a little longer to do, because you have to teach people, because you have to maybe run some workshops in order to get them to understand how a digital story, how to create one, and like the lab we were talking about, and there's editing time and go community or going into the and doing their video, but ultimately it's the return is very worthwhile. It really does elicit a richer and like a really high quality experience for engagement experience. It also really engages this deeper emotional and relational piece for communities and participants. So what it does is it really lends to this idea of, and people often will contact me and ask me, how do I build relationships with a community that I want to research in? This is one great way to do that because it's a process that unfolds over a period of time. And when relationships are built and there's more and more of an understanding about what the project is about, people will invest more time and they invest in the outcome, and it makes them really fully engaged in that process versus just sort of being a sign-on partner that provided a letter of support and will get the annual report at the end of the year. This is actually engaging folks in ways that are, it's eliciting emotion, it's eliciting connection. And it is really, really wonderful and has proven to be a wonderful tool for participatory action research and co-creating projects, especially with marginalized groups whose voices are often not seen and heard or valued. So this is a wonderful, empowering tool for community research. And I've definitely seen this firsthand, that something that could be just your status quo project become quite successful. And what happens is communities will invite you back or welcome you back. So that's really what I wanted to, I think, convey to everybody here, is that this is something that's worked for us here at Global Water Futures. It's continuing to work for us. And I encourage everybody to try it out if you have a chance. And if you want to, you can also send me an email with a link to your digital story if it's something that you feel comfortable with. if you end up creating one. So for any more resources, tools, future webinars, creating the recording of this webinar, you can go to our Global Water Futures website, which is gwf.usask.ca. You can find the Knowledge Mobilization tab, and you'll see all of our webinars listed there. So I just want to say thank you. And thanks again to Denise for coming in and sharing her awesome story. And I want to open it up to any questions. We have about 10 minutes left if anyone has questions. Okay, anybody with any questions? So I think I'm going to exit. Thank you so much.